And we're live. So today we have an interesting topic to discuss. So we're going to be talking about the impact of COVID-19 on our economy and especially how it impacted the rail industry. But as we know, a lot of things happened in 2020 regarding the rail industry. And today we have a special guest, Dev Jain, with us. Hi, Dev. How are you doing?
Hey, I'm doing well. How you doing, Ravi?
Very good, man. Thank you. So, Dev, can you just give us a brief introduction about what you do? What's your company about, and how you started operating in the rail industry?
Sure. So 2 years ago, I founded RailVision Analytics. What we do is we take data that's already on locomotives in the rail industry, and we use that to save fuel, predict maintenance, and ultimately improve the safety of the rail industry.
That's pretty awesome, Dev. So, Dev, you have an engineering background, right?
Yep, mechanical engineering at McGill.
Amazing. And how long did you start this company?
I started it 2 years ago while I was still a student at McGill. So
Congratulations. So, Dev, the purpose of this capsule is to explain the importance of rail companies in our economy and get a better understanding and a brighter perspective on the role they play. So,
yes.
we're going to start right ahead with the first question being, what are the major companies and how do they split the market share?
Yeah, so the rail industry is pretty interesting. Essentially, there's classes of companies. That's how they're defined: class one, class two, class three. And it's strictly defined by revenue. Off the top of my head, I don't know the exact number, but let's say it's something like class one is 300 million and up in revenue. So class one is actually only 7 railroad companies. All the big ones we know, for example, CN, CP, in the States as well, BNSF, UP. There's a lot of others, but there's only 7 of them. Then after that, we get into class two, class three. So class two are probably ones we use a little bit more often, Via Rail, Amtrak, as well as commuter rail. And class three, also nicknamed short lines, is something that we call first mile, last mile. Essentially, they transport goods from one specific location onto the main line, and then usually do the opposite on the delivery. They take it from the main line and bring it to that specific location. So, to give you some examples in agriculture, it might be just moving grain product from one area of farms onto the main line to ship across the country, or similar in mining, coal, any mine that's built. Probably there's no class one operator in the area, so they'll build a short line that just goes and transports the goods from that mine onto the main line, and that distributes it across the country. So those are examples of short lines, and other examples are like small tourist trains. Sometimes you can get on a small train and it'll just do a lap for 1 hour and show you something, show you nature or something touristic. So that's also an example of a short line. So in essence, the rail industry, it's very concentrated in that regard. There's only 7 companies with 90% of the share, the big ones, and the other 10% belongs to the other 600.
Wow. So very interesting. All right. And now if we go more in depth into the topic, people often they relate when we speak about the rail industry, they often think about like via rail, it's a lot of
Yeah.
passengers, but essentially there's a lot of cargo being transported by the rail companies. Can we talk about the goods that are being transported, importations, exportations, perhaps?
Yeah, sure. Well, freight transportation by rail, that's essentially the backbone of the North American economy. And it's like you said, a lot of people, when they think about trains, they think about rail, they think about just the train that they get on. So Via Rail or XO in Montreal. But yeah, trains transport our goods across the whole entire country. And what they're really good at transporting is heavy gear. So, say, for example, you want to buy raspberries. Well, raspberries are perishable. They have a very limited lifespan. So it's probably something that'll come by truck or plane, something that comes really quick to you. But if you want to buy wood, if you want to buy a new car, if you want to buy car parts, anything that's really heavy, I mean, rail transportation is probably the best transportation in terms of how much fuel it takes to transport a huge weight of goods. So that's where rail is really, really useful across North America in carrying heavy goods.
So it's very efficient in the way they transport goods as
Yeah.
opposed to other, like, let's say, airline carriers, right?
Yeah, it's definitely the greenest form of transportation between rail, air, and road.
Perfect. And are we essentially talking about non-perishable goods for rail companies?
I'm sure there are perishable goods as well, like a lot of agricultural products, but stuff with a much longer lifetime. It's usually not something that will expire in a week's time. So meat, fruits aren't really carried by rail, but grain products, for example, which have a much longer shelf life, those can be carried by rail.
Perfect. So let's go right ahead and jump in the topic of COVID-19 impact on the rail industry. Is the closures of borders between Canada and the United States impact the industry at all?
Not so much. Rail's deemed an essential industry during all of this, so the trains can pass in the same way that they usually pass. Of course, there's customs, but it's exact same thing. There's no further restrictions. So, to be honest, COVID, the borders haven't really impacted the rail industry too much. No.
Okay, and how about the lockdowns? We know factories are shutting down, people are losing their jobs. Are we expecting any product shortages?
I wouldn't say we're expecting product shortages for the most part. Of course, there's definitely some exceptions, maybe specific factories that have quite a strong hold in that regard. Maybe if they're not operating, there might be a specific product shortage. But as a whole, I would say not really. Um, and again, the rail industry is pretty proportional to the economy in general. If the economy slows down to some regard, right, people are just buying less, that'll impact the rail industry. It'll show, right? There'll be less goods being transported, and vice versa as well. So my guess is as good as yours for how much people are buying right now, right? If they're trying to buy more, maybe because they're at home in confinement, or if they're trying to buy less just because, well, they don't need the material right now. So rail's kind of a direct reflection of that, of how much people need, and overall, it's doing well right now.
Perfect. And as we know, towards the end of April, I believe April 20th, we know that oil prices and fuel prices were at all-time lows.
Yep.
How does these prices impact the rail industry?
Well, locomotives run on diesel mostly across North America. They're a few electric, but for the most part across North America, it's diesel. I was actually just reading today about fuel a little bit in the rail industry, and the low prices are having a slightly negative impact on the rail industry because the rail industry, transportation, is generally deemed as a very fuel efficient means of transportation. So when fuel prices are really, really low, it brings its competitiveness down with regards to other industries, right? I mean, if you think of a perfect world where fuel costs nothing, well, air, road, rail, they're kind of all on an equal playing field then with regard to moving some big shipments. So fuel's slightly negatively impacting the rail industry because as its prices are low, it makes the rail industry less competitive. But I expect that there'll be a big boom again in oil prices once this is all over. Right now, the demand's so low, but once everyone's ready to get out again, oil prices will really skyrocket. So then again, it makes the rail industry much more competitive once the oil prices are really high.
Perfect. And is this crisis impacting your company at all, like your operations?
It's definitely slowing down operations to some degree. The rail industry's uh, quite a traditional industry in the way that making sales isn't online or over the phone. You really need to speak to someone in person. And that's kind of putting a barrier because we can't really speak in person. We can't go to trade shows. So definitely it's slowing down operations a little bit. But then again, we are a software company. So everything that we do software wise is done without any problems. We can all work from home, no problem. Yeah, the sales part is a little bit tough during this time, but once it's done, companies will be looking for new innovative ways to save fuel to predict maintenance. So again, for us, it might be a little bit tough right now, but we expect a boom by the end of all of this.
Now we're gonna talk about like procedures that were implemented or new restrictions that were implemented within the borders and the custom tariffs. Did you see anything new from that perspective?
No, I didn't see anything new. I think there's a few surcharges and tariffs that are going down slightly to reflect the current economic situation, but no drastic changes right now.
More in depth into rail line blockades that happened right before COVID
Yeah,
19. I believe that had a much greater impact on that
yeah,
industry, correct?
yeah, definitely. The blockades that happened about a month before all of this, that was really a severe impact. In fact, COVID was probably the saving grace of all of this because it took well, it continued operations. It made operations flow a lot more smoothly, and people were less focused on the rail industry because there were so many other problems going on. So, yeah.
So, can you tell us more about essentially what were those rail line blockades? How long did it last? When was it?
Essentially, all these blockades started. There was a First Nations community in British Columbia who was having a pipeline built through their reserve, and there was a land dispute over it. Without going into too many details about who's right and who's wrong, essentially, the country North America stood up for this community and protested peacefully to say that this isn't acceptable. And the way that they did that was that they blocked rail lines. Um, Blocking rail lines essentially crippled the economy. One of the few main ones that they blocked, for example, in the Kingston sub, right near the Tyendinaga Reserve near Belleville, Ontario, they blocked that line. That's really a main artery to connect, well, almost Ontario and all the west of the country to Quebec and all the east of the country. So with that being blocked, there was no shipments that could go across. Via Rail couldn't move across. And as well, another one in Montreal on the Mercier Bridge, uh, the Kanawaki Reserve, they also blocked that. So that prevented all the trains from moving across. EXO had to cancel one of their lines because of that and change to buses for anyone who lives in Candiac. So yeah, definitely the repercussions on the rail blockades, that was much, much more severe. And I know in speaking with a few small companies that don't even own any of this part of the line, for them it was just tough. Small rail companies, because they couldn't even get fuel shipped to them because of various blockades. So that was really a tough few weeks for the rail industry.
So you're definitely bringing an interesting topic to the table, because I was reading, and every single day of rail line blockades, we're talking about $250 million that we're not moving in terms of goods, value of goods, right? And it's very interesting that you said that these rail line blockades were crippling the economy, because as we know, the little entrepreneur at the corner of my street, he's selling coffee, right? But if he's not getting his raw materials, and he's not getting his cups to sell coffee, well, essentially he can't even he doesn't have revenue, right? So people need to understand that these goods benefit the end consumer, and if these entrepreneurs were not receiving the raw materials, well, the economy itself is really getting impacted and affected by this.
And the rail industry usually impacts much further back in the supply chain. So, say for example, at the depot on the corner, maybe he can still get his supplies, but the person who he's buying his supplies from, maybe that comes by rail, right? They still have to supply because they still need to distribute whatever it is, coffee cups. But now maybe there's another surcharge. They can't bring it by rail; they have to bring it by truck. So that costs a lot more. And then at the end of the day, the person selling the coffee, well, now it costs a lot more for the cups. Maybe he's not making good margins anymore on the coffee at all. So the coffee
Exactly.
prices increase. So there's definitely that cascading effect by these rail blockades.
Amazing. And so January and February 2020 were definitely rough for the rail industry. Were there any layoffs? Are you aware of layoffs?
There were a lot of layoffs. There were well, specifically just in the news, you can see that CN laid off quite a few people. That was kind of during the blockades as well as prior to the blockades. I can't comment too much on that because I don't know CN's internal structure very well. But yeah, the beginning of the year was pretty tough for the rail industry in general, just with oil prices dropping a lot right at the beginning of the year. And then issues like this as well. Even Via Rail had quite a few temporary layoffs because their main route, which they operate, I'm sure, I don't know exactly how many, but probably about 20 Toronto Montreal trains a day. I mean, if none of them are operating, then what can they do with the employees? So there were quite a few layoffs that resulted in it, but a lot of them were temporary as well.
So it's really interesting because there was a sequence, literally, of bad events for your industry.
Yeah.
So, what's your opinion about how the government and how these companies like CN, CNR handled the rail line blockades and how they reacted towards the COVID-19 pandemic?
Well, the way that the government reacted towards the blockades, I thought that was acceptable. So essentially, to recap how they reacted, people were protesting on the rail lines, and the rail lines are not public property; they're private property. They're owned by the companies themselves. So the government had every right to essentially kick everyone off right away because they were private lines, but they didn't because people had to have a voice. And to be honest, it's kind of unfortunate that the only way Indigenous people were able to have a voice and speak up about something that was happening was to do this, to block rail lines, and it did have an effect. People did listen. The government did listen. Everyone knew about it, and so that's how they got their voice across, and they were able to. Uh, so the government did an acceptable job in allowing them to speak up, even though it was private property. But at the end of the day, it was private property, and all of Canada would suffer if the rail industry had to stop completely because of this. So the government did, in my opinion, act well in terms of at a certain point, after about a week, they said, okay, your voice has been heard, but we need to keep the economy moving for the whole entire country. And that's essentially what they did.
Did you see opportunities during this sequence of events?
We focus a lot on equipment data, so on the locomotives itself, and really analyzing everything to do with the equipment. Something we focus on a little bit less is the movement of the equipment, because that's essentially the bread and butter of any railroad, how they plan their fleet operations. And so I think that would have been the obvious way to go about helping someone during this time, is to assist software wise with fleet operations. But like I said, it's the fundamentals, the bread and butter of any railroad. So that's something that they manage all the time, that they're really good at adapting to. And we could always provide additional support on the locomotives, on the equipment.
Perfect. We're already running short on time, so let's finish off by hearing your perspective for the future of this industry. Is there something companies can do to be more prepared for events such as rail line blockades or even the COVID-19 pandemic?
Hmm. Interesting, because, well, it's hard to predict a blockade. I'm almost ready to say it's impossible to predict when someone's going to protest, right? Now, of course, in other countries, this is less of an issue because sometimes tracks are elevated or underground, so you can't protest on a bridge really if you can't even get on it, right? Um, it would be really hard to predict a blockade. But what could be done is to make companies a little bit more flexible, a little bit more adaptable to these situations. And the rail industry already has a tough time adapting to these situations because there's no detours, right? On a road, if whatever the 40 is blocked, well, you take the 20. If the 20 is blocked, you take the 40. If both are blocked, there's still other roads.
Yes,
There's a lot of detours to take. But in the rail industry, there's usually only one track. You have to go through it. And so that already makes it a little bit hard to adapt to. But definitely there are other solutions. And it revolves around cooperation as well a little bit. Each railroad usually owns their own part of the track. And so negotiated rights to operate on other companies' tracks, that could help in making the rail industry a little bit more adaptable to situations like this.
Well, for sure. And locomotives have been around for centuries now, and
Yep.
this industry has proved itself to be a very solid one. Before we leave each other, I'd like to get a broader understanding of operations that you do with your company. So, concretely, can you give us an example of what you guys do on a daily basis and how you help companies become more efficient?
Yeah. So like I said earlier, we take the data that companies already have from their equipment. So every locomotive has something called an event recorder, and what it does essentially is monitor all the equipment parameters, and such as the voltage, the current going to the motors, the speed, what throttle positions the operator's in. So it monitors all of these things. It's essentially like a black box on a plane, but for a train. And they're usually used for just looking at what happened during an accident. But we take a lot of this data, as well as a lot of other data, schedules, who's driving, weather, GPS data about the tracks. And we try and recreate the story of how the trains are actually being operated. Once we can recreate the story of how the trains are being operated, we can look and see where a lot of fuel is being used in the driving and where there's opportunity to save fuel. And so primarily what we do is we look for those opportunities to save fuel. relay those opportunities. So explain to the companies how to save fuel in those specific areas. And then we build software around that to monitor their compliance, if they're following what we're saying, how much fuel they're saving, and how it's impacting, for example, their on-time performance and other parameters.
So Dev Jain, CEO and founder of RailVision Analytics. Thank you, Dev, for being here. We're definitely going to have you back on the show to talk more in depth about your entrepreneurial ascent and get a better understanding of your background, and especially something that I find super interesting, how you being involved in the military impacted you as an entrepreneur. Thank you, Dev, for being with us today, and we'll have you back very soon.
Cool. Thanks a lot, Rami.
Thank you, Dev.